Lee Anderson, and I am a Kevin B. Harrington Student Ambassador. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for tonight's event. The Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civic and political life of their communities and to strengthen democracy. The Institute is nonpartisan and does not endorse political issues or candidates. And before we begin this evening's program, I would just like to remind you to turn off any and all cell phones or other devices that make noise. Tonight's speaker, Pavlich, is a very successful journalist and published author. She graduated from the University of Arizona with a degree in broadcast journalism and currently serves as a contributing editor for Town Hall magazine. She's also a frequent contributor to Fox News Channel, serving as a rotating panelist for the program Outnumbered, and has appeared multiple times to discuss current events on such networks as CNBC, CNN, and MSNBC. Ms. Pavlich was named Blogger of the Year in 2013 by the Conservative Political Action Conference, and was honored as Woman of the Year by the Claire Booth Lewis Policy Institute earlier this year. In 2012, Ms. Pavlich published Fast and Furious, Barack Obama's bloodiest scandal and its shameless cover-up, which was critically and popularly acclaimed. Tonight, Ms. Pavlich will be discussing her most recent book, Assault and Flattery: The Truth About the Left and Their War on Women. She will be addressing social behaviors and norms, views of gender relationships in the modern United States, and the relationship between political parties and gender issues. Ms. Pavlich's book will also be available for purchase immediately following her comments at this table here to my right. And immediately following Ms. Pavlich's remarks, we will have a brief question and answer period. So please wait until a student ambassador reaches you with a microphone before beginning your question. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Pavlich.
You're allowed to keep your cell phones on if you're tweeting, but only good things. Thank you so much. Good evening. Thank you so much for having me here at the New Hampshire Institute for Politics. It is really incredible to be in a place where so much presidential activity has taken place, where so many amazing people have had the honor of speaking. I am proud that I can now say that I've been here and that I've been able to do that. It truly is an honor and something that is very, very special. I'm from Arizona originally, and although I think Arizona is the best state in the union, your live free or die slogan I think is the best in the country. So I thank you for that, and I hijack that often and say I'm not from New Hampshire, but I like their slogan and I use it often. You know, walking through the halls here, it's for me exciting because I work in journalism, but obviously I'm very interested in politics, and seeing how the politics and press come together in this building for multiple things throughout the years is really exciting for me to see how they work together. So that's another reason why I'm excited to be here. But of course today I'm here to address the issue of the left being portrayed as champions of women. My new book, Assault and Flattery: The Truth About the Left and Their War on Women, came out over the summer. And every book comes from an idea. You know, books don't just write themselves. You have to come up with ideas, proposals. It's like a big thesis outline. And I had a couple moments where certain ideas started popping up for this book and leading up to, deciding to make the move to turn this into a book. And one of the first moments that I had came in February of 2012 when Nancy Pelosi invited 30-year-old Georgetown law student Sandra Fluck to testify on Capitol Hill about why taxpayers should foot the bill for birth control. And at the time, Fluck was portrayed as a young woman in her early 20s, but that wasn't true. She had been well into her adult years for a decade before making her statements on Capitol Hill. Now, my office is in Roslyn, Virginia, which is right across the way from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And after listening to her testimony, I looked across the river in disbelief, and I thought, how is it at my age, which was 23 at the time, as a young professional working hard to pull a paycheck and pay my own bills, this 30-year-old woman wants me, as a taxpayer, to pay for anything other than my own personal medical needs and prescriptions? I was in kind of disbelief. Was $9 a month really that big of a deal to come up with? And the answer was obviously no. But the left likes to uphold people who pass responsibility for their actions on to others. So I wasn't surprised when Fluck was held up as a hero. And then a few months later, the big moment came for me when I thought, okay, this is when I really need to do something about this. I was sitting at the 2012 DNC convention in Charlotte, North Carolina, and for hours and days on end had been listening to speech after speech about how Mitt Romney had a war on women, how conservatives hate women, etc., etc. And not only did Bill Clinton speak that night after Sandra Fluck, but the DNC honored a man not worthy of praise given the theme of the convention. Now the TV cameras didn't catch this, but because I was there, I did. In between speakers and during a commercial break, the DNC played a 7-minute long, glorious tribute video to none other than Ted Kennedy. And as if that wasn't bad enough, they plastered the words in all capital letters, "Women's Rights Champion," across the screen. It was pretty amazing, but for some reason, they skipped over one of the most iconic moments of his life. The time when he drove drunk off of a bridge, wandered away, and left 28-year-old campaign staffer Mary Jo Kopechne to die in his car. And nobody dared to utter the words Chappaquiddick in the arena that night, but I had plans later to talk about it on television. So that night before this video was played, I knew I was booked on a political panel for Piers Morgan's show, which at the time still existed. I was on with Piers, my friend Richard Grinnell, who served as one of Mitt Romney's foreign policy consultants for his campaign, Hillary Rosen, the woman who infamously said Ann Romney has never worked a day in her life, and self-avowed communist Van Jones. And you know, Rich is foreign policy, but I was kind of on my own with everything else. And before sitting on set, I was really hoping so hard that Piers would bring up Ted Kennedy. Really, I knew what I was going to say, I wanted to say it, and I was just hoping he would bring it up. And thankfully, my moment came. In the video they played at the convention, they showed Mitt Romney debating Ted Kennedy when Romney challenged him for a Senate seat back in the 90s. And Romney said in this debate that he was pro-choice, and of course that he's since changed his position, but that didn't stop Piers from asking me in his accent, "Katie, did it make you uncomfortable hearing Mitt Romney espousing the joys of being pro-choice?" To which I answered, "No." You know what made me uncomfortable, Piers? That at a DNC convention claiming to be fighting the war on women, they would play a 7-minute tribute video to a man who left a woman to drown in his car. That didn't go over so well. The panel exploded. Hillary Rosen immediately yelled, "Oh, come on." Piers said on air that my comment was below the belt. Didn't say anything about the actions that were taken that night. And then during the break, Hillary Rosen turned to me and said, "I think what you said was disgusting." To which I responded, "I think what he did was disgusting." Thank you, Hillary, for pointing that out. So it was after that moment that I knew I had to make a counter-argument longer than a soundbite. And it was time that someone pointed out the hypocrisy and lies coming from the left about women. Democrats had been running the conversation for too long, and I set out to debunk the sacred cows of the so-called war on women. I found that women in America have been lied to, manipulated, and used by the mainstream media and the Democratic Party, as if there's a difference. Both of which tell women that they have their best interests at heart, but they don't. And the reason I know this is because I've seen firsthand how they treat women who don't toe their line. Many of you have been persuaded to think that there is a war on women being waged by Republicans, but in fact, the real story is very different. If liberals believe women can protect themselves, then why do they oppose a woman's right to carry a handgun for self-defense? And if Hillary Clinton is the ultimate female role model, then why has she built her political career on her husband's philandering while silencing his many female whistleblowers and covering up sexual abuse during her time at the State Department? If Barack Obama is the most pro-woman president in history, then why does he seem to want to make women completely dependent on the government? If the right to an abortion gives women personal autonomy and sexual freedom, then why are its debilitating after effects often overlooked? And finally, if Republicans are so insensitive to women, then why is the sexual lechery from politicians like Bill Clinton and Ted Kennedy often defended, justified, covered up, or ignored? Those on the left love to talk about women in one way, but in reality treat women in an entirely different, opposite, demeaning way, full of broken promises and false hope. When President Obama ran for re-election in 2012, he didn't do so based on his record, but instead he propagated one of the most damaging and egregious offenses against women by promoting the false idea that reliance on government is empowering. I watched the 2012 campaign up close, and the Democratic strategy hinged on women more than any other campaign in history by distorting the truth and lying about contraception bans. And after spending weeks on the campaign trail, months on the campaign trail, one thing became very clear to me. Democrats didn't want women to be independent from government. They wanted women to be dependent on government. And like many Democrats before him, President Obama sold victimhood as empowerment for votes by scaring women into thinking government is the answer to all of their problems, and that they probably can't survive without it. During the 2012 election, the Obama campaign released an advertisement called The Life of Julia. In the sickening portrayal of the federal nanny state, the Obama campaign walked potential voters through the left's vision for women's equality. The ad demonstrated how at every age level and every stage of her life, from her childhood to adolescence to young professionalism to her career to parenthood and to retirement, the Obama welfare state would be there to give her what she needed to be successful. If, of course, Julia votes for the Democratic Party. This is the true war on women, to make women feel dependent on the political success of the Democratic Party and radical liberals. Susan B. Anthony said, quote, I declare to you that women must not depend upon the protection of a man, but must be taught to protect herself, and there I take my stand, end quote. She would have been outraged at the paternalism rampant in The Life of Julia. It's a two-part war. A war waged to make all women subscribe to certain social behavior, including complete sexual liberation and independence, and a war waged to convince women that the Democratic Party was the party that would give them everything they needed to achieve the narrow-minded view on life, if they pledged their political allegiance. The basic gist of the Julia campaign, was propaganda to push and to show that female voters how Obama's policies would help them through life, starting at the cradle and ending at the grave. The Life of Julia is not one of big government lists or pro-women policies, despite what the left wants you to believe. Instead, in reality, it's actually one of disappointment, hopeless dependency, and broken promises. Obama's deliberate posturing to young women through the use of Julia should be noted. And why didn't we ever see a Life of John? It's apparent that Team Obama and Democrats who support him only see women, not men, as helpless victims of their gender in need of government assistance to survive every stage of their life. The feminist groups weren't outraged about the sexism in The Life of Julia, and they certainly didn't demand to see the same things offered for someone named John. And the truth is that Democrats now are doing the same thing for the 2014 midterm elections and will continue to do so in 2016, scaring women into believing they can't survive without liberal policies and Democrats in office. Let me give you a few examples of how this is currently playing out. Recently in Wisconsin, where Scott Walker is trying to hold onto his governor's seat and Mary Burke is running against him, DNC Chairwoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz said, quote, Scott Walker has given women the back of his hand. I know that is stark, I know that is direct, but that is reality. What Republican Tea Party extremists like Scott Walker are doing is they are grabbing us by the hair and pulling us back. It's not going to happen on our watch. Now, she apologized much later after much criticism, even from the left, which I give them credit for. But not only is she scaring women and lying to them about who Scott Walker is, she's comparing him to a wife beater and a domestic abuser, which also belittles women who actually do go through domestic abuse. But, you know, she still has a job, and you would hope that after comments like that, that she would not have a job. I think if comments were made on the opposite side of portraying a woman that way, then Debbie Wasserman Schultz would have a problem with it. In North Carolina, Senator Kay Hagan versus Tom Tillis, Kay Hagan is a Democrat. She just released an ad that says, the women of 1954 love Tom Tillis, but the women of 2014 will be voting him out. Acting like, if you vote for Tom Tillis, you're going to be back in the 1950s where you have no rights at all, which is just not true. In Colorado, Senator Mark Udall, who is a Democrat, versus Republican Congressman Cory Gardner. Last night, the Denver Post hosted a debate, and the first question, with everything going on in the world, and this is a national, this is not a governorship, this is not a house, a local house race or a local senate race. This is a race for the U.S. Senate, a national, an international issue, right? What did they focus on? The first question was about contraception. Contraception and birth control. That's what they wanted to focus on with everything that's going on in the world right now. And the question about contraception, Mark Udall decided to, and has done this throughout his campaign, accuse Cory Gardner of supporting bans on birth control and contraception. When the reality is that Cory Gardner has been very open about wanting to make contraception over the counter. So he's not only lying in the debate, but he's also lying when it comes to his campaign ads to try and show young women and lie to them about getting them to vote for him because he thinks that the only thing they care about is contraception and birth control. And here in New Hampshire, on a little bit of a different note, not so much using the contraception argument, but we saw attacks hurled at Mary Linda Garcia by her Democratic counterpoint, Representative Peter Sullivan, when she announced her run for U.S. Congress. He essentially made fun of her shoes. He compared her to Kim Kardashian, who of course has a sex tape and is famous for that. And he refused to apologize for those comments. And if she would have been on the other foot, there would have been, I think, more consequences for Republicans for saying that. So while these statements are ridiculous, they have a big impact. And people behind these statements are distracting away from their dangerous big government policies by throwing out things that really don't have an impact on the national conversation or at a policy level. And here's the reality. Reliance on government doesn't provide a life of success and independence. It instead provides one of disappointment, hopeless dependency, and broken promises. Again, Democrats won't tell women that because, after all, it would expose their phony platform. The way Democrats have repeatedly defined women by the pills that they take, by their body parts, and as victims of their gender is abhorrent. And women should be appalled at being classified in such a blatantly sexist, repulsive way. Not to mention, big government policies are terrible for women. Obama's policies have had a devastating effect on women in the most personal way possible, through their health care. Obamacare was sold on the idea that it would be good for women. On the campaign trail, women have been told in race after race that before Obamacare, they were discriminated against because of their gender. In 2012 and now in 2014, the left has accused conservatives opposed to Obamacare of waging an assault on critical health services for women. When you actually look at what's happening with the results of Obamacare, it's Obamacare that is waging a war on critical health services for women. They've said that if Obamacare is repealed, being a woman could be considered a pre-existing condition. Now this is patronizing to say the least, but let's look at facts. Women are far more complicated than men. All the men who are married in here, I'm sure you would agree with me. Right? Women are just more complicated on a lot of different levels. Women are pretty much the Cadillac of the human body. And when it comes to healthcare, women, after all, they have babies. It's kind of a big deal. It's a complicated thing. And women actually visit the doctor statistically more often. They consume more healthcare, and therefore their healthcare costs are greater. So contrary to popular belief, big bad insurance companies aren't simply charging women more money because they're sexist. We don't have a sexist health insurance industry. Insurance companies charge women more for healthcare because they cost more. They're using more services and they require more care. First off, women typically live longer than men, which means they require and consume more long-term care. So over the period of a lifetime, they pay for more care. Second, women are built differently than men and sustain injuries more easily. And based on doctor's visits alone, women tend to take part in more preventative medical services. Men tend to be a little bit stubborn when it comes to going to the doctor and doing the preventative measures. They're less stubborn when it comes to treating injuries or illness with medication, and are more likely to take prescription drugs that are paid for through insurance. A 2012 National Women's Law Center report shows women between the ages of 15 and 44 spent 68% more on health care than men in the same age range because they're using more services. Women pay more for health care based on economics, not discrimination, as many have falsely claimed in their political campaigns. And while liberal claims about healthcare discrimination are false, so were the promises that they made to women about how they could keep their doctors and keep the plans that they liked, even with Obamacare. Barack Obama's re-election campaign targeted women voters in swing states who listed healthcare as their #1 concern. However, instead of the Affordable Care Act making services more affordable to women, many watched their health insurance premiums and deductibles rise dramatically. And according to the Manhattan Institute, Obamacare has increased women's rates by 62% nationally, and depending on the states, some women have seen their premiums triple. In addition, millions of women have received letters stating their insurance plans have been canceled because they do not comply with the Affordable Care Act, or in other words, with what the government thinks that you should be purchasing for your own healthcare needs. And so President Obama, and Jeanne Shaheen, by the way, who of course is running in New Hampshire again, repeatedly promised that if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor, period. If you like your healthcare plan, you will be able to keep your healthcare plan, period. He promised Obamacare would provide better healthcare and more access to healthcare. But we've seen poorer healthcare, less access, and 6 out of 10 doctors retiring early as a result. So where does this policy, I'm going to shift gears here a little bit, where does this policy philosophy come from? That government is the answer, that women should be dependent on government, that the free market system isn't the way for people to get health care, that the government, and through more of a socialist, single-payer system is the way that women should get health care, and the general population, of course, should get health care. So during my research for the book, I figured, well, these women's groups are sure influencing the White House and their policies at a lot of different levels, so maybe I should go check out a conference and see what that's all about. Who's running the show? Where are these policy talking points coming from? Where is this big government philosophy coming from? So last year, I applied for press credentials to cover the annual National Organization for Women Conference in Chicago. Because after all, NOW bills itself as the largest organization of feminist activists in the United States, with 500,000 contributing members and 550 chapters in all 50 states. And according to its website, since its founding in 1966, NOW's goal has been to take action to bring equality about for all women. Unless, of course, you're a woman who believes in capitalism, or if you're a conservative. So prior to applying for my press credentials to the convention, I came across a NOW newsletter which claimed its goal for the future was to expand and diversify membership in our ongoing efforts to bring different perspectives to the organization. So I was pretty sure that they would be happy to welcome me into the organization to cover the convention, because after all, I have a pretty different viewpoint on things than the ladies of NOW. And I would clearly be adding perspective and diversity to the group. But instead, just 2 days before my departure for Chicago, where it was held, I was informed that despite being a credentialed female member of the press, my press credentials for the conference were denied. Quote, "Thank you for your interest in attending this year's NOW conference as a member of the press," someone named Sarah Coppersmith wrote to me in an email. "However, press credentials for the conference will not be issued to you. We regret any inconvenience this may have caused." No other explanation offered. 2 days ahead of time, I said, yeah, things are a little inconvenient. I got a flight, got a hotel. So I wrote back and just said, look, as a female, credentialed female, emphasizing female here, member of the press, I'd like to know why the credential to the conference was denied, especially considering flights and hotel rooms have already been booked. I look forward to your response. Thank you. And she never responded, so I went anyway. And the only way to go to the NOW National Conference is to do something that I never thought I would actually do. I became a member of the National Organization for Women, because in order to go to the conference, you have to be a member. So I am now a card-carrying member in good standing. I don't think they've realized that I've written this book yet. So when my plane touched down at O'Hare in Chicago, I wasn't sure what to expect. I knew that Chicago was ground zero for radical movements, and the 1960s feminist movement was no exception. Because after all, Chicago was home of Saul Alinsky's, of course, Rules for Radicals, Bill Ayers, Weather Underground, Jeremiah Wright, and of course, Barack Obama. And when I walked in to the conference at the Hilton in downtown Chicago, I expected to see a room full of young women fighting for their rights, only to find that there really weren't that many of them. And it wasn't the speeches that caught my interest at the convention, but instead the exhibit hall and the kind of materials that were being sold, which I also thought was strange, considering that required a transaction with money. I was assuming everything would be free since it was a community of people, but I actually had to give them money for the things that they were selling me. They were selling books about Marxism and the feminist movement. And I quickly realized that now wasn't about women's rights, but about socialism, big government, and abolishing capitalism. I even purchased my own copy of the Communist Manifesto at this NOW conference, and copies of Education for Socialists, and Marxism and Freedom, which I thought was weird. I didn't think that really matched up together, but hey. And you know, when any conservative organization like CPAC has exhibitors the mainstream media deems radical, this leads to a number of headlines in the news designed to embarrass the entire movement. But by contrast, when the nation's largest women's rights group features exhibitors that preach Marxist ideologies and condemn American capitalism, there's no comments about it anywhere. And it wasn't just one display, it was all of them. That's what they all were selling, that kind of material. And the other thing is that Democrats love endorsements from big women's groups like NOW, and those endorsements are celebrated. But in fact, Marxist teaching is not a tiny fringe part of the modern feminist and Democratic Party agenda. It is its centerpiece, and this is something I extensively go into in the book. From the time of Karl Marx in the 1960s and up until today, the progressive women's rights movement has hardly been about women's rights at all, but instead about transformation of American society and the transfer of wealth through government force. Women's rights have simply acted as a veil to distract away from the true intentions of progressive activists and liberal politicians who take advantage of them. The socialist revolution in America depended on two things: a breakdown of the family and women voting for progressives. We've seen both in modern politics through the promotion of single women, taking advantage of single women, keeping men out of the household, promoting single motherhood, and then of course, as long as you vote for progressives, you can still survive, as long as you do all the things that you're told. In their 1974 manifesto, Prairie Fire, The Politics of Revolutionary Anti-Imperialism, domestic terrorist Bill Ayers, Bernadine Dorn, and the Weather Underground devoted an entire chapter to how the women's rights movement should be used to advance revolutionary goals, calling feminists to join the ranks and political agenda. Now, I know we're not supposed to connect Bill Ayers to Barack Obama, but I do. And what Bill Ayers said is exactly what we're seeing playing out with Barack Obama's agenda in a whole bunch of different ways, not just on women's issues. But this is what Bill Ayers wrote. Sexism will not be destroyed until imperialism is overthrown. It is in the collective interests of women to do this and take full part in building a socialist revolution. We need power. Socialist revolution lays the foundation for the liberation of women and begins with dismantling the tenacious institutions of sexism. Those institutions are talking about our capitalism, the free market system, and families in American society, which we've all seen attacked over the course of the past 40, 50 years, and have been very successful. They laid out a 40-year plan. They were very patient. But I think it's important to point out that despite people like Bill Ayers and the women are now wanting to lift people out of poverty, their anti-free market ideas actually keep women in poverty. It should be no surprise that according to a report from the United Nations Development Project, women living in anti-free market systems or socialist systems, especially in Eastern Europe, experience higher rates of poverty. And so in closing, I know that I'm sick and tired of being defined by pills, body parts, and as a victim of my gender. There are more important issues to care about and to discuss. Women succeed through opportunity, free markets, and hard work, not through dependence on government or through socialist policies. Thank you, and I'll take your questions.
So if you have a question, we're going to use the microphone. So who's first?
Thank you. Great speech. Obviously, though, the left has been very effective in persuading lots of women who are not otherwise inclined to vote a Democrat to do so because the Republicans hate women and are waging war against them. And I was wondering what arguments you found the most effective in talking to, especially to women like that, independent women, we'll say.
One of the biggest, wake-up calls for me was during the 2012 election, just talking to women. Now, you can't expect young women in particular to understand something they've never been told. They've never been told about how the free market system works. They've never been told about the opportunities they can have without government regulation. They've never been told to think about things in a different way than they've been told on their college campuses and, quite frankly, through the K through 12 system. So I think that's the first problem, is you can't expect people to know something that they've never been educated about. On college campuses, where a lot of just students in general become more liberal than they were when they came out, the only people running the show there are these women's centers with very far left progressive Marxist material being handed out to young women. So the first step is simply presenting the other side of the argument. What are their options? And the second issue is asking very basic questions, like, do you want to be an independent woman? And the answer, of course, is going to be yes. And then you can have a debate about which policies allow women to be more independent and which ones allow them to be dependent. I think that getting away from the issues, addressing, Republicans had a huge problem in 2012 and also in 2013 with the Virginia governor's race with Ken Cuccinelli and Terry McAuliffe, because they think that if they don't address the birth control abortion issue, that it'll just go away. But what we've seen happen is that when Republican men in particular run away from that issue, their opponents then are able to paint them in whatever way they want to. So they have to come out and address it, say this is what, Chris Christie did this really well when he ran for re-election in 2013. Came out, he said what his stance was, take it or leave it, and he was running against a woman and it never came up again. So just acting like it's going to go away doesn't work. Addressing it is important. And I think, too, pointing out that, conservatives get accused all the time of being the ones who bring social issues into a campaign or an issue. If you actually look at where it comes from, the left always brings it in as an issue. Can anyone tell me who brought the birth control contraception issue into the 2012 debate?
Stephanopoulos.
George Stephanopoulos. Yeah, here. And it's like, what? Everyone was confused about where that came from. And then it turns into this idea that it came from conservatives, when really it came from someone who used to work in the Clinton administration who is now posing as a TV journalist, right? So it's important to point those things out and to come back forcefully to talk about it in a way, the Colorado race, for example. Cory Gardner has come out and said, you're lying about the fact that you think I want to ban contraception. I don't, and he has a counter argument and a solution of offering it over the counter, right? So he's addressing it that way, and the race is very tight, which is a good thing. So addressing it and presenting the other side of the argument to people who've never heard it before. I can't tell you how many women I talked to who had never even heard the other side of the argument in 2012. So presenting it, and candidates need to address it directly up front, and calling out their opponents when they say things that aren't true about them is also helpful.
You answered in part what I was thinking in terms of my question in this last remark you made, Cory Gardner, I believe.
Yeah.
What puzzles me is, and I agree with you, that there's an education process, and unfortunately that takes time. We start with K.
Or preschool.
Yes. We got, you know, we are in a cultural war. In fact, we've been in one for a century. A lot of people haven't noticed, and it's coming to a head now. It has come to a head, as a matter of fact. And we see parts of it showing up in the Mideast. It's odd that the Now gang is not interested in the vile transgressions against women in over 1 billion people that comprise the Muslim population.
There's also a lot of information in the book about that as well. Didn't get to it tonight, but
Good.
There is some of that in there as well.
Good. But what I'm wondering is, because obviously, as I say, the education process is a time-consuming and worthy process to engage in. We have politicians running now, and you mentioned Cory Gardner, but many of them either are themselves, and I'm talking about Republicans right now, conservatives, libertarians, are substantially uneducated or gutless in terms of presenting this issue to women. It is my understanding, and you may know about this, and I'd be curious if you do, and this is the part that is my question, I guess, my understanding is that a lot of the Now gang treats abortion, Planned Parenthood treats abortion, and numerous other groups as the Holy Grail. And in fact, my understanding is that most women do not think of it that way. And those who have had abortions or come close to them don't consider that one of the fun periods in their life. And so, and when they're talked to and presented that this is a terrible option, and there are many other ways, but aside from that, what the morality, the ethics, and the actual political ramifications are for generations to come. Why, when they're talked to in this way, that is presented this way, and why not? Here's what I was thinking. Why is it so many politicians who supposedly know this, or is it that they don't present this in an effective way? You're saying Cory Gardner does. I'm not familiar with what he said, but I know some have tried, but there are many that do it very ineffectively. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think that they don't address it in the way that they should. So for example, going back to the Colorado race, for example, and this is something that we've also seen in Texas with Wendy Davis and Greg Abbott on the abortion issue. If you actually look at polling, and we're talking about, you know, there's some differences when it comes to when conception begins. People have a disagreement about that. But when you actually look at the polling, there's hardly any disagreement about the length of time women should be enabled to have an abortion. And 63% of women in this country, according to Gallup polling, are vehemently opposed to late-term abortion. But yet you have candidates like Mark Udall in Colorado and Wendy Davis in Texas saying basically that they don't want any restrictions on abortion, including up to 9 months of pregnancy. And Barack Obama as well. So the way that Cory Gardner's gone about it is talking about that in the sense of 5 months and having women who are either pregnant or who had a baby at 5 months talking about it themselves. It's not always the politician who has to do all of the talking. It's them telling stories about other people, telling stories about families, telling stories about that individual who was that 5-month-old baby who is now a 5th grader or whatever it may be. But I also think that they're more focused on the conception issue, when really they should be focused on, you know, that's important, but the broader issue of where they have agreement among women and the general public. You know, the general public now is pro-life. There are more pro-lifers in America now than there are pro-choicers. And if you take a look at where you can get the most agreement, it's on the late-term issue. And with the advances of science, you know, the left always claims that they're pro-science. They're pretty anti-science when it comes to the abortion issue. And presenting some of that to people and understanding that, I think, is important. So finding where you have the majority, which is on the late-term issue, and starting from there and moving backwards. And they're going to have to do that in a way that is effective in the way that they see fit. And the bottom line is some states and some races, voters don't really care much. I mean, there are places that are more liberal than others, but there are a lot of people in the middle who don't know much about the abortion issue, and if they're told about it, they tend to change their mind. So. That's all. Yes, sir.
This is more of a general question about when you're talking to people around there. a lot of the arguments that I've seen sometimes, and again, this is going to be a gross generalization, so bear with me, but it seems like sometimes when there's a logic argument that goes on for a little while, then all of a sudden eventually, which one side or another, you can fill in the blank on who, realizes that they're losing the argument, and all of a sudden the whole thing turns to emotion. Oh yeah, well, you're mean. You know what I mean? And so the argument all of a sudden then there's nothing more to debate about. It's like, you're mean, no, you're mean. Yeah. I'm just kind of curious, what are some ways that you actually have found, or in talking to people, that either when the conversation turns that way, or just in general, how do you fight, I say fight, but how do you discuss what are potentially really emotional topics on a more factual basis, or on an emotional basis, but I'm just saying.
I think that you have to fight emotionally in a smart way, and that's difficult to do. But the bottom line is we do live in a soundbite culture now, whether it's on television or through social media. And you know, the left is very good at coming up with these one-word answers like equality, equal pay for equal work. They don't want to get into what that actually means and the policy positions that you have to get around to that. And sure, you know, it's always conservatives, they get to their argument in the third paragraph, right? Whereas liberals get to their argument in the first line. It might not be a deep argument, it might not make much sense, but it feels good, right? And I honestly think that the way to combat that is by using emotional language that can serve your own policy position. I don't think you're going to win an argument, an emotional argument based on this long, drawn-out, logical agreement or a conversation. I just don't think it can happen. So I think that understanding, you know, what words work, language is very powerful, which is why the left changes language all the time. I mean, they've taken the word liberal, that used to mean conservative, really, and they've turned it into that. I mean, climate change, global warming, you know, they're changing that whole thing. I mean, they do this on purpose. But I think that finding language that represents what you represent in your party and your more extensive policy positions, which should be discussed at length in the appropriate setting. But when you're talking about campaigning and you're talking about getting a message out, I think that it's important to argue emotionally, but in a smart way with words that really have an impact. So fighting emotion with emotion, even though it doesn't seem as intellectually, you know, proper. You know, we have to kind of stoop to that level sometimes. So, yes, ma'am.
Speaking of language, if you believe that the left defines women by pills and body parts, how do you believe the right defines women?
I think that they define women in the way that they would define men, as human beings who are capable of being successful as long as they work hard. And if women are going to argue that they want to be equal, they shouldn't expect to be treated unequally. And that's what the left does, is they say that they're for women's equality, but then they put women into this one special box and put them into this category where they're victims and that they can only be empowered through government subsidies and help. Conservatives define women as being able, just as men do, to start businesses, to make their own decisions, to pay for their own birth control because they're strong enough and able enough to pull a paycheck and to pay for their own things. They don't need someone else to take care of them. They believe that women should be able to defend themselves against people who want to harm them in a way that allows them to exercise their right to bear arms. I mean, women are treated in the same way. We don't say because you're a woman, you must require birth control from the government because you can't function without it, or you can't control yourself enough, or decide where you should spend your money. You know, I think, I don't speak for all conservatives, but you know, I, as a conservative woman, feel treated the same way as my brother was growing up. We weren't treated differently. I wasn't treated differently because I was a girl. And I'm very proud to say that I pay my own bills. I don't want anyone else paying my bills, whether it's the government or someone else. And the left has replaced men with government. And the difference there is that men typically tend to care about the people that they're with, whereas the government doesn't. So that's what I would say. Yes, ma'am.
As a young woman on a college campus, I find that most people are pretty uninformed when it comes to policies, and I find that they go to sources like cosmopolitan versus all the democratic ideas. So when my roommates come to me, they're like, well, Cosmo says, like, this is what we want for a woman. How do you feel that you can get women to understand the true implications and policies that politicians are pushing?
Well, long term, I would hope that we could get some other women's magazines out there producing the other side of the story in a non-political but political way. You know, they're not overtly political. What they do is they'll write an article, and it's almost like propaganda. They'll write an article and say, look at all these really strong women, and they just happen to all be liberals, right? Hillary Clinton is the only one you can look up to. Wendy Davis, right? I would just kindly get them National Review or Town Hall Magazine or something a little more serious and say, you know, why don't you take a look at this just to get the other side of the story? You know, you don't have to be monolithic. Not all women think the same. And it would be good to educate yourself in a lot of different sources before you make your choice based on a fashion magazine. But say it in a nice way, you know. Clearly they like that. You don't want to insult what they like. But, you know, just offer them something. Offer to give them another perspective. And I think that can hopefully change. There's not as many pretty pictures of shoes, and I love shoes, but in our magazine, but you know, it's certainly a well put together magazine. So I would offer them things that are similar, but that offer a different perspective. And just say, you're really taking your advice from Cosmopolitan? And ask them why. I mean, ask them why they think that's good. And if they're getting the whole side of the story, they'll probably tell you no. And then you want to offer them something to fill that void for them. So more knowledge is important. Anything else? Any other questions?
Ask what? I'm just curious, as reasonable as you think your position is, the facts on the ground are that this works, right? I mean, women in large numbers vote for Democrats. So I don't know, what does that say about women?
Not necessarily. I mean, single women vote for Democrats, married women vote for Republicans. So not all women vote for the left. I mean, there's a distinct line between single women and married women, which is why the left has an interest in keeping women single and not encouraging family and marriage, right? On the issue of, yes, you're right, it worked in 2012. It's not working so much now. The war on women rhetoric is getting worn out. Democrats aren't necessarily winning on the issue of scary, you're going to take your, birth control is going to get taken away. They've lost that battle a little bit, and I think that the Colorado race is a good example. Texas is a red state, so I'm not going to use that as an example, but Colorado is a purple state where there's a lot of people who probably are maybe pro-choice, but they're kind of getting sick of this argument that women aren't capable of purchasing their own birth control. Women are seeing their healthcare premiums go up significantly, especially women under 30. They're looking at how much money they have to take home as a result of Obamacare. They're seeing that their doctor's choices are now limited, and they're acting on that because they're smart and they don't only care about contraception. So I think that Debbie Wasserman Schultz, too, with her comments about Scott Walker essentially pulling women back by the hair, that was a kind of a jump the shark moment for the Democratic Party. So I would say it worked in 2012. They didn't address it properly, but they've learned a lot since then, and it's not working as well now, which is a good sign. Yes?
Are there any women's groups that are conservative as opposed to like now? Are there any alternatives for women to belong?
Well, on college campuses, actually, the Network of Enlightened Women is a great organization started by Karen Agnes, and it was started 10 years ago, and the reason she started it because she was in college and she went to the Women's Center and asked if there was a conservative club she could join. And they laughed at her. She laughed her out of the building. So she started a conservative book club on campus where they read books by conservative authors and bring new people in. So that's on college campuses, which has expanded. I think they're on 300 campuses now, so that's a good place to start. In terms of, generally speaking, the NOW organization is older, tends to be older. There aren't a whole lot of women's groups that are equivalent that I'm necessarily aware of. And I'm not sure if that's just because conservatives don't feel like they need a women's group. They feel like they're equal. Like, why do I need a special women's group? And we don't focus on women's issues. We focus on all issues. I think that's probably why that's not necessarily something that exists. And they also have families and work and people take care. I mean, there's not a lot of time for those things, I don't think, as well. So to my knowledge, there isn't one that certainly is not one that has as much impact as Planned Parenthood or NOW. So they're not making policy. But the Susan B, that's not true. Susan B. Anthony list, they're more nonprofit organizations. Susan B. Anthony list, Claire Ruth Institute. I mean, there's a couple, but they're significantly smaller, I think, in terms of their impact on policy.
I'll just suggest Concerned Women for America. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, Concerned Women for America. They also do a lot of work in DC. So there are a couple, and with their combined resources, I think they probably have a pretty big impact on things. It feels like now has a bigger impact right now because they're actually helping with policy in the White House. But you're right, there are a couple of women's organizations that are set up a little differently, but have definitely had an impact on the public debate, especially in the Hobby Lobby decision, for example.
Time for one more?
Yes, ma'am.
You said, I saw you before, you talked about the Hobby Lobby case being totally lawyers for that. The Hobby Lobby people were all women.
Right, so I'm sure most people in this room are familiar with the Hobby Lobby decision. And immediately after that came down, groups like the National Organization for Women, Democrats, the left, made a lot of really false claims about what that decision meant, saying that your boss can now decide what kind of birth control you can take, your boss is now in your bedroom, your boss can now decide if he's going to cover contraception or not. All those things were not true. Hobby Lobby, before the Supreme Court case and before Obamacare, before the mandate went in, covered 16 out of 20 forms of contraception. 16. They went to war over 4 of them that happened to be against their moral principles. They are still going to provide 16 forms of contraception moving forward, just like a lot of other corporations. So that's the first thing. The second issue was, and you had Ruth Bader Ginsburg essentially accusing her fellow justices of sexism for voting on the side of Hobby Lobby, which is, I think, just disrespectful on its face and inappropriate. But then you had women like Terry O'Neill, who's the president of NOW, being on MSNBC saying, this is an assault against women, we're not going to take this, we can't believe the sexist Supreme Court would allow this to happen. So there's 2 arguments here. The first is that the entire legal team representing Hobby Lobby was made of women. But yet, for some reason, the media and NOW decided not to mention them. Even, despite the side of the political aisle you're on, you would think that they would want to, if you're pro-woman, to portray these women who had just won a case that will go down in history as one of the most controversial cases in U.S. history. But no, they just brushed them aside as if they didn't matter, despite them having these huge accomplishments as women who were attorneys arguing in front of the Supreme Court. The second issue is, when Roe v. Wade was decided, it was decided by men. So were those men sexist? No. I mean, it was a legal decision. But I really was upset with this brushing off and non-crediting of these women who had just won this huge case in front of the Supreme Court simply because they disagreed politically. I thought that was really unfair. All right, I think that's it. Thanks, guys.